Hello, welcome to Chandwell. Over on the layout, the industrial building is coming along quite nicely. This is part 3 of the series in which I show you how I use the free to download software Inkscape to build this industrial building. And this is what we're going to do this episode. So I'm building the building as 2 internal elements, which I'll then join together to make one big building at the end. So in this episode, I'm going to show you how I made the insides of the building. That's the floors and these old chipped concrete painted walls. This is the inside of the building, and the outer walls will then go on top of this to complete the building off. I'm going to start with a little overview of how I intend the buildings to go together. If you've ever made a building downloaded from scale scenes, you'll be familiar with the technique because it's a very similar technique to how those kits work, and it's how I taught myself this technique. So without further ado, let's have a look and I'll show you what we're going to do. Before we switch it into Inkscape, I just want to show you how I'm going to construct the building. So if we think about it, the building from the top, and this is not to scale, is going to look something like this. It's got that extension on the right hand side, so the right hand side of the building is a little bit wider. So when I construct this, when it's all finished, what we're going to have is we're going to have the outer walls are going to be the full depth of the building, and they are going to be made from 2 layers of 1mm card. So these walls will be 2mm thick. The texture will wrap around them, so it'll look like part of the building, so it won't look odd. So we're going to have 2mm outer edges, and then inside that we're going to have a 0.5mm layer of card which is going to be wrapped with black texture to represent the downspouts. This is the technique that scale scenes buildings use for the downspouts, and it's a really effective way, especially in Engage, of getting downspouts on your buildings. Then inside that, and offset by 1mm from the front and the back, is going to be the inner skeleton. So the inner skeleton is going to be constructed of 1mm card, and it's going to fit inside the building, and obviously there'll be one on each side. So like I said, this is 1mm card, and because it's inset, that gives us a space to put the front of the building. And the front of the building will slot between the downspouts layers and stick onto the inner support, which I'm calling the inner skeleton. So they'll go somewhere like this. If you look at the completed model I've got on the inset there, you'll see how these layers go together. But what we're looking at today is the inner skeleton of the building, so that's represented by these red lines. So we're going to do 2 parts of the building, the left hand side and the right hand side, and then glue them together with the floors in place. I'm leaving the middle for now, so we're working on this bit and this bit today. So with that in mind, I hope that makes sense. Let's switch to Inkscape. So let's spend some time putting some guides onto our drawing. This is the drawing that we used to create the card mock-up. I've split the windows back out into individual shapes, and you can do that by selecting the whole shape and choosing Path, Break Apart. That just puts them back into shapes that I can deal with. I'll cover that a bit later on, but let's get these guides on. So this is the side of the building, and as I said before, the front of the building and the back of the building are going to be inset into the side of here by 1mm, which is the width of the card that I'm using. So I'm going to draw a rectangle, as usual, any size, and then make sure that it's exactly 1mm wide. Using snapping, I'm going to drop it onto the side of the building, just like that. Now I'm going to drag that up a little bit just to make it a little bit taller, and then I'm going to duplicate it with Shift-Control-D, and then using snapping, drag it along and drop it onto the other side as well. So this represents the inset that the front of the building will be sitting in when the side of the building gets put on. Now those are 2 there. I'm going to select them both, and over on the right hand side on the fill and stroke panel, I'm going to reduce the opacity a little bit. I'm going to make it 50%. That just lets me see through the guides so I can see the shape underneath. Okay, so they're good. I'm going to select the guide, I'm going to duplicate it, and I'm going to drop it on either side of the brown shape as well, because that's the other end of the building. So those are the 2 sides of the buildings with some guides on into which the front of the building will slot. You'll see how I use these later on when it comes to actually making the actual shapes that I need to stick to card and then cut out. So because I'm going to be doing quite a few guides like this, I'm going to just add a little reminder of what the colours mean. So I'm going to come up to the top left, I'm going to draw a rectangle, I'm going to hold Control down, which makes it an actual square, and then using the text tool I just write in what the colour code for that guide is. So the green rectangle, it's a 1mm inset for the front and the rear of the face of the building. So now it's time to put the guides on the front face. If you remember the little drawing that I did at the beginning, that's quite a few. Now I'm not going to go through it step by step because you've seen me do it already, so I'm just playing this one a little bit faster than I did in real time. But we have a 2mm layer, first of all, for the outer wall, which goes before the downspouts. We then have a 0.5mm layer, which I'm colouring purple, and that's going to go inside of those, and that is a 0.5mm downpipe layer. Inside that, we have a 1mm inner skeleton layer. Now that is going to be the slightly narrower one that sits inside as the inside walls. So there we are. Those are the next set of guides in place. Next, I'm going to move on to the inner walls. Now I'm going to have an inner wall going through the middle of the building. So what we need to do is we're going to drag a rectangle into place, and using snapping, I'm going to snap to the middle of the top of the roof there. I'm also going to draw a line across there just to help me guide this up. So drawing a line and using snapping, I get that to exactly the right height, and that's just a quick shortcut instead of having to use the align tool. So I've now got a 2mm thick rectangle, which is going to represent the inner walls. I'm using 2mm because there's going to be a piece of wall facing outwards on both sides, so it's going to be 2 layers of 1mm card put together. And I'm just going to colour that yellow and put a note as to what that is. And that comes in handy because we can use that as a guide when we print it out to get the walls all glued up into the right place, perpendicular, as a nice guide. So you'll see how that is used later on. So that's a 2mm inner wall that goes down the middle of that side of the building. I'm going to duplicate it with Shift Control D, drag it into the place and snap it into the middle of the brown, and then align it by selecting them both and using the align tool this time. Just going to align them to the top there. Okay, so that's the inner walls of the 2 side parts of the building in place. This building is complicated a bit further by the fact it's got this visibly open archway in the middle of it, and also it's got the extension sticking out on one side. So for that end, I'm going to put another 2 inner walls, and I'm going to use 1mm wide because that's what I'm using for the inner walls, and I'm going to align them down the centre of the join of where the pediment reaches the roof. So I'm going to put those there. I'm going to align them with the rest of the guides I've created, and that will just help me build the building later on, and you'll see how I'm going to use that shortly, how I'm going to split that building up. When it comes to constructing the building, I'm actually going to make it in 3 pieces. We see the middle bit of the building there with the opening on, that's the middle bit, and then the 2 bits on either side of it are going to be exactly the same from the front anyway. So I'm going to call them building 1, 2 and 3. So all I'm going to do is use the text tool and put on a label just so I know what I'm talking about later in the build of the building. So I'm making the inner skeleton of the left hand side of the building. Now because it's inside and the front is going to stick on top of it, I need to make it 1mm shorter either side. So to do that, I select the 2 green rectangles and choose Path Union. That turns them into one shape. I can then select that shape plus the orange shape and use Path Division. And that splits the orange shape into one. It takes 2 1mm slivers off the edge, which let's then select and delete. I appreciate that was quite quick. You can always rewind that and see it again. But essentially all I'm doing is I'm using the green guides as a way of cutting off a 1mm edge from either side of the orange. Now, I'm also now moving the yellow guide up so that it only affects the top 2 floors of the building. That's because the bottom 2 floors are going to be open. The actual very bottom is just going to be underneath the ground, so you're not going to see that one. And I'm also making the floor guides 1mm thick. That's because the floor is going to be made out of 1mm card. So we've got this 2mm bit in the middle. I'm just going to make that a different colour. That is just going to help me glue the 2mm thick walls in place, and the horizontal lines, the floor lines, they're just going to be guidelines to help me glue the floors in place. So that's essentially it. We now have the correct side for the inner skeleton of the building and guidelines for where the floors are going to go. All I'm doing now is I'm just changing the widths of these shapes just to make them all line up nicely on top of the orange shape of the side of the building. So I need to get a little bit of detail on these walls. This is going to be the inside wall of building 1. So we've got it in place, we've got all the bits in it. So because I'm going to add a texture to the inside, I'm going to have some kind of plastered wall. I need to get all the rooms separated out into individual shapes. So all I'm going to do is, using snapping, I'm going to draw rectangles above each of the rooms now. This bottom one, of course, is going to be underneath ground level, so I don't need anything on that one. But I still like to have a shape on it just to keep them separate. So I'm going to fast forward a little bit as I draw these shapes, and I'll see you at the other side. So this is the inside wall, the left wall of building A. I'm just going to select everything, use Shift-Control-D to duplicate it, then holding Control down, drag it to the drag it to the right, and snap it to the side, and then just draw a line down the middle. This now has two inside parts of this building. We've got the right wall and the left wall. So just preparing it now for the textures and for eventual printing, what I'm going to do is I'm going to select all of the black guidelines and make them white. That is just because we don't want to waste ink for something we're just going to glue something straight on top of. So holding down Shift, I select them all and then switch the colours to white. We're using rectangles, so it's the fill colour here. So there we are. And then also this bottom bit, because this bottom bit, the red bit, is going to be underground, we don't need anything on here. So I'm just going to fill those in a very, very light grey. I don't want to have white, I do want to have something that's a little bit of a different colour to the white paper. It just helps when printing it out to get the cuts in the right place. When it does come time to print this out and cut it out, I do find it useful to label each part. It helps when cutting it out and deciding what order to glue things together. So before I move on, I'm just going to use the text tool to add a note as to what this is. This is building 1, and it's the skeleton, which is the inside part of the building. I put on which piece is which, so this is the inside left, and it goes on 1mm card. That just helps me when I'm printing it out and cutting out the paper before deciding which card to glue it onto. And this one over here is the inside right. So it's building 1, the inside left wall, and the inside right wall. Now I think it might be nice to have a little window facing into the alleyway in the middle of the gap. So I'm going to show the guides again and select the small window. I'm going to copy it and then paste it back on our skeleton layer. Holding Control down, I'm going to drag it to the left so I've got it in exactly the right height, and then I just need to get it into the middle. So I'm going to draw a rectangle around the front room upstairs and just use the Align and Distribute to align it into the centre. That gives us a window in the middle of the front half of the building. So with the window in the right place, I'm going to select the orange rectangle and the blue rectangle and use Path Difference. I've done this many times before, it just cuts a hole out of the rectangle. So that has given us a window in the front part of the building pointing into the open alleyway. This is the inside wall, obviously, so you've got to think of it back to front. So that is the front part of the downstairs left-hand building pointing into the alleyway. So I've got that in the right place. Now it's finally time to add some textures to this building. So I just need to clean up this drawing a little bit, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to put individual rectangles using snapping so it all lines up nicely. Just put individual rectangles on the top of each of these things. What this lets me do is it makes it easier to put the textures onto the shapes later on. So I'm just using the techniques that I've shown many times before. I'm just drawing the shapes, copying them, moving them around and aligning them all, and then moving them to the back. So once I've got these shapes, it's ready for the textures. Now I'm going to use another video in future to show how I get textures imported and scaled to the right size. So I'm not going to do that now, but here we are. It's a texture. It's like a kind of a grotty old painted concrete wall. And I want this brown bit to be painted on the bottom part of the wall. So I'll drag it into roughly the right part of the shape. And selecting the texture and the shape, the orange shape, I then right click and choose Set Clip. What that does is it replaces the orange rectangle with the bit of the image that's showing through. Let's do that again on the yellowy brown one. Move it into roughly the right place, send it to the back, select the rectangle and the image, right click, choose set clip. And it's as simple as that to get a texture on there. Now the upper ones up here that are going to be in the attic, I don't really mind, they're not going to have a bottom bit on it, so I'll just put it here. So I select the shape, set clip, and there it is. So those are the inside side walls of building 1, which is the left hand side building. Now I appreciate that might have been a little bit quick, but I will be doing another video in future on how I work with textures and how I get them applied to buildings as I go. So that is building 1 inside sides of the skeleton done. I'm just going to move them up there, and now I'm going to do exactly the same as I've done but for building number 2. Now you don't want to see this, otherwise you'll be on for over an hour all told when this video is finished. So I'm going to fast forward this little bit and we'll watch how I do it using exactly the same techniques as I've just shown you but for the other side of the building. So let's go. So here we are at 36 times normal speed. You'll see that I did exactly the same as I did on the first sides. I'm going to split it into individual sections and then I get the windows in place. It took me quite a while to get the windows in place. I wasn't sure exactly what I was going to do with the side windows at this point, but I eventually settled on this arrangement. I think it's going to look quite nice. So once I've done that, then I've got the two sides of the building done. So I've got the left building and the right building, the inside walls. And just to help me when it comes to printing out, remembering what I'm doing and when I'm cutting them and everything, I like to put labels on. So the white line along the bottom there, that's the ground floor. So use the text tool and put it in. I use Ctrl D as usual to duplicate and then just drag it up and change the text. So that's building 1 first floor. Oops, Ctrl D and then drag. And then this is building 1 second floor. So just put these labels in so when it's printed out you know exactly what it is that you're doing and what you're cutting. So we'll finish that off on the other side as well. And now it's time to get the floors in place. So before we start getting the floors in place, we need to do some measurements on the building so we know exactly the size of the floors that we're going to print out. So I like to just have that on the canvas so that I know what I'm working with. So how wide is building 1? We've got the building 1 inside width. We also want to know building 2 inside width. So just using the text tool, type those into place. Now one of the best tools for this in Inkscape is the measuring tool. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put the guides back on and then scroll down, and this is where those guide rectangles really come into their own. So the width of building 1 is the distance between the inner layers, the 2 pink rectangles. So using the measure tool and snapping, you can see exactly how wide that building is between those 2 lines. And I can just come up there and type it in. So building 1 inside width is 35.03 millimeters. I can then come over and do it exactly the same on building 2. So I'd select the measuring tool, click on the line where I'm measuring from, hold Ctrl down to keep a nice straight line, and then drop it on using snapping where the measurement wants to stop, and that's on the other side of the pink line. So the width of that is also 35.03 millimeters wide, and that shows that I've done my job right in getting the proportions right. So but it is still useful to measure everything just in case there is a mistake in there. So how far back from the front does the ground floor go? Now as you can see up above, I'm not having an inner wall on the ground floor. I want that to be nice and open. So that is the full width of the orange piece on the inside of the green rectangles. If you remember, the green rectangles are representing where the front of the building will go. So the skeleton only needs to go back as far as it is between the 2 green lines. So there we go, that is 48.12 millimeters. Now I'm going to do the same for the other building on the other side, but just a quick note about the precision of the millimeters. Obviously 48.12, it's a very, very precise measurement, and you wouldn't normally use this precise level of measurement if you were just building a building by yourself. However, don't be tempted to round up to the nearest millimeter, because when this is printed, it's printed exactly to the measurements that you use. So if you start rounding up or rounding down, you run the risk of measurements slowly creeping out. If you do it a lot, you might end up with millimetre or even 2mm gaps in places and things don't fit properly. So don't be tempted to round up or round down. Use it as exactly as possible. So 61.73mm for the depth of this building on that side. And that way, when it gets printed out, stuck to card, and when you cut it all out with your craft knife, you get things exactly right. Obviously the eye can't tell the difference between 61.73mm and 62mm, but you run the risk of it not fitting together properly if you do round up or round down, so do stick with it. So the upstairs rooms obviously don't go back as far, so for this one we need to measure from the green line to the yellow line. And now we'll do the same for the other side, and then the measurements are complete. You might notice that the depth of the downstairs building 1 has changed, and it's actually rounded down to exactly 48mm. Now that was because when I had 48.12 before, I'd actually mismeasured that, so I corrected that, but all the rest of the measurements were right. And now it's time to start making the floors that we can put in between the building to give it some structure. So to do this, I'm going to start with the centre wall. The centre walls go down the white line, the white vertical line at the top between the roof pitches. So to do that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to start by just drawing a rectangle. And like usual, the rectangle, it doesn't matter what size it is. So I'm just going to drag that onto the side of the canvas here. Now what we need to do is we need to get this rectangle sized to exactly the right size for the wall that we want. So first of all, I've realised I've missed a measurement, and that is the wall height. So let's measure the height of the wall. I'm not going to use the measurement tool for this because there's no need. We already have a rectangle in place to guide where the wall is going to go. So all I need to do is work out the height of that rectangle. So to do that, I select the rectangle. What I'm going to do is I'm going to drag it down a little bit because I don't want the card to stick up and go over the top of the apex when I put the roof on. So I don't want the wall to go all the way to the top. So after dragging it down, it's 39.130mm. I'll put it back to where it was, but I'm actually going to round this one down. I'm just going to make it 39mm. Like I said, just so the card doesn't stick over the top of the roof. So it makes sense for this one to be rounded down slightly. Okay, so let's go back to our rectangle. So this is the building 1 centre wall. I basically just read the measurements off my list and then just type them in up here at the top. So type that one in, its height, check its width, type that one in as well. And then the red rectangle is now exactly the right size for our building 1 centre wall. So that's in place. Now let's do building 2 centre wall. We can just duplicate building 1 because it's exactly the same upstairs. So Shift Control D duplicates it, hold Control down, move it to the right and put it next to the first one. I'm just going to change the colour, make it a different colour just to keep them apart. Now I'm going to do the same for all of the rest. Let's do the second floor. So the second floor goes from the front of the building to the centre wall. So I've got all the measurements I need in my list. So all I do is duplicate the rectangle, drag it down and type in the width and the height. And that gives us a rectangle that is the right size for the floor. Now I'm just going to fast forward as I repeat this for all of the other pieces of the floor, and then I'll see you on the other side of that. So here we are, let's get some texture onto these. We don't want our floors to be bright red or pink. So I'm going to use the same technique as I did with the walls. I'm going to select each rectangle individually and then duplicate them. So there's a whole duplicate layer on top now, and of those that are selected, I'm going to hold Shift down and click black to give them a black outline. Then I'm going to select them all again, and this time I'm going to choose Path Union, and that's going to create one big shape. That one shape is now comprises all of the floors. I've got some nice texture here of some floorboards. I'm going to drop that on top, move it to the back with the back button at the top there, and then select the red shape. I'm going to right click and choose Set Clip. Now because I've done that on the red shape, which is behind the empty shape with the black lines on, the black lines are still there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select the black lines. Again, I'm going to have to select them individually. I'm going to hold down Control as I click on them. So select those shapes, and then I'm just going to move the size or the width of the lines down a little bit. And I like to use 0.2 millimeters. That helps me, it's a good width for helping cut out shapes. So have you spotted the mistake? What I've done is I've managed to fill the back wall texture, or the back wall shape, with floorboard shapes. So I need to undo what I did. I'm going to right click and do release clip. That takes the floorboards out. I'm going to select the combined shape and click break apart. That makes the red rectangles back to individual shapes. I'm going to select the ones that are actual walls, use path union to put them back together to one shape, then right click and choose set clip. And that puts them back together. So now the floors look like floors and the walls look like red rectangles. So I'm going to drop the wall texture onto the walls and drag it into roughly the right place. Now I should have measured this and got it exactly the same height so that the brown matches up with the height of the brown on the back walls and the front walls that I did earlier, but I didn't. I just tried to guess. It doesn't matter too much, you're not really going to be able to tell. So I got them into the right place, chose right click, set clip, and now we have the back walls looking like back walls. Now of course the back walls are going to be 2 layers thick. There's a back wall that points out to the front of the building, and there's a back wall that points out to the back. So to do that, I'm going to copy this, I'll select it, Shift Control D to duplicate it and move it up. Now when these are printed out and cut out, they'll be glued back to back to make one side, to make 2 sides of the same wall. So there we are, this part of the building is complete. All we need to do now is print it. So I select it all, I copy it, and I come down to the A4 sheet of paper that Inkscape uses to show you the size of the paper that you're working with, and we'll drop it down there. I can get rid of most of the text now that I know what everything is. I'm going to select this building and rotate it by 90 degrees, and that just drops it on there, and it fits nicely. And then I'm going to do the same with the other parts of the building. Now I realised at this point that the floors are all one shape because I added the texture to them all as one shape, and it doesn't quite fit in the gap. So I could print them on another sheet, but what I decided to do was break them apart back into their original constituent shapes, and by releasing the clip and then breaking apart the rectangles, and then dragging them into their final printed position like this. So what I realised there is I actually could get it all to fit onto one sheet of A4 paper. I don't like wasting paper, and it doesn't cost the earth, but it's better not to waste it at all. So I spent some time trying to arrange these shapes in such a way that they all fit. Once I've got it where they all fit, I then put the rectangles back together into one shape, so the same as before, selecting them all, going up to the path menu and choosing Union. Then once I did that, it's all one shape, I could drag the floorboard texture back on top, and then right click and choose Set Clip. That puts them back together with their floorboards. And that is it. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to print that out, stick it to card, then start cutting it out and gluing it together. And there we are, it's printed really nice. I'm really pleased with the colours of the back wall. It's kind of exactly the look I was after, so that's quite good. So put that to one side. I've got a 1mm thick sheet of card and a glue stick. I buy these in bulk off eBay and works out really cheap. I need to cover the complete surface of the card in the glue. Then I basically just roll on the paper and then roll it off with a wallpaper roller to get rid of any creases, bubbles or that kind of thing. So cover the card completely. It's really important that the entire surface of the card is covered. Roll on the paper and then roll it off, and it's worked out quite nicely. So I put that aside for 1 to 2 hours. I want the glue to be completely dry when it comes to cut it. If it's even slightly wet, you'll end up ripping the card. Made a bit of a mistake here, look, I've got building 1 ground floor written over the top of the floorboards there, but you'll never see that when that's on the inside of the building, because the windows are tiny and no one's going to be able to see that, so that's fine. So let's get this cut out. And there we have it. Once that's all cut out and glued together, we have the beginnings of the real building. I'm really pleased with how well it's going so far. No obvious mistakes yet. This building on the right here, I've put this one on the layout back to front for this video. That window shouldn't be facing the viaduct, it'll be facing the inside of the alleyway next to the arch, but that's just the way I've put it down there. I do eventually glue it together the right way around. So the building is fitting quite nicely. It's exactly the right size, but we knew it would be because we went through the paper mock-up and the card mock-up stages. So that's it. So please, if you found this interesting or useful, or if you've got any tips or questions, especially questions, please put something in the comments down below and I will answer them in the next episode. Join me for the next episode where I show you how these get glued together and the outer skins put on to make one nice cohesive building. So until then, stay safe and I'll see you next time.